Welcome to MEI Modelling with Algorithms. We're on the topic of critical path analysis, and this is video 1.2, using dummies in activity networks. Now, there are two reasons why we might need to use these so-called dummy activities in an activity network. The first reason is to preserve the logical order of the processes, so in order to make sure that two activities that we know must happen in a certain order actually do so, and that is represented in our graph. And also was a requirement that was mentioned in the first video that every activity is uniquely defined by an ordered pair of events, and sometimes it's impossible to do that without using dummy activities. We'll show dummy activities using dotted lines. They will have a direction, but they will have zero length. Now we're going to start with a very simple example. You'll recognize that type of table from the previous video, and you may well feel, looking at that and having seen the previous video, that we could go ahead and draw an activity network for this process without any problems. But as you'll see when we start going with this, there is a problem, and the only way to solve it is going to be to use a dummy activity. So we'll begin in the usual way. We can see that there are two activities at the top of our table, activity A and B, which don't depend on anything else, and so they can both start from our starting node. So we always have a start node, a source node, which has label number 1, and activity A and activity B start from there. And then we can see we've got activity C that depends only on activity A, so that's fine. We can add a node here. We'll wait for a moment before we number these nodes, because we need to make sure that the numbers are such that activities are always going from a smaller number to a larger one. So sometimes it's worth just waiting before you put these numbers in. But we know that activity C has to happen after activity A, so we can have activity C coming from there. Now let's have a look at activity D. Now activity D depends on both A and B. And the problem is, at the minute, we don't actually have an event. I can put an event here, but at the minute this event is at the end of activity B only. This one's at the end of activity A only. We don't have an event from which we can start activity D, such that it will clearly depend on activities A and B. So that's a problem, because I can't join this activity to end here, because if I did, then this activity C would then depend on A and B, but it should only depend on A. So basically what we need to do is, if we're going to have this activity D depend on both A and B, there needs to actually be an activity that goes from here to here, like that. Okay, because then activity D can't take place until both of these have, and this one clearly depends on A. So this is what's called a dummy activity. We're representing it with a dotted line. It's not an activity which is listed in our table, and it will have a duration of 0. Now activity E just depends on activity D, so we do need an event here, and activity E must leave there, and then of course to finish we'll have to have both activity C and activity E meeting at this sync node. Now we've not actually yet put numbers on these nodes. What is important is that the number of this one is lower than the number of this one, so that this dummy activity is going from a smaller number to a larger one. So this can have number 2, that can be 3, that's 4, and that's 5. Now, one thing that's worth saying here is that obviously you don't always know from the outset what your network's going to look like in the end, and it may frankly look a bit of a mess, because you maybe made a guess about where something was going to be going and you found you had to sort of shift it round. So by all means, once you've done a rough version, turn it into a neater version, and that's what we have here. Now here's another example. It looks similar to the previous one, but it is actually slightly more complicated. We're going to need more than one dummy here, and for more than one reason. So again, in the usual way, we'll start by looking at the events which don't depend on anything else. Activities, I should say, which don't depend on anything else. So we'll have our first event there, and activity A and activity B, like so. Now, this time both activity C and activity D depend on A and B. So when we write down our events here, activity C might come off in this direction, or activity D might come off in this direction. And whichever we do, though, we're going to need a dummy activity between here, just like before, in order to make sure that both of them depend on both A and B. What complicates this slightly, though, is that we also have this activity E, which depends only on activity B. So it might be worth actually getting activity E down first, because that is actually going to affect which direction we'll have to put the dummy in. Because if I have the dummy going from A to B, then that would then mean that activity E depends implicitly on activity A, which actually it shouldn't do. So that forces me to make the dummy go this direction, and that in turn forces me to make this event have a smaller number than this one. Then activity C and D, they depend on A and B, so they can both come from here. There's C there, there's D. Now, there are no more activities to include here. We just need to think carefully now about how we can conclude this, how we can get our sync node in. So, well, let's draw the sync node, and let's think about what needs to happen. Well, I think we're fairly safe to attach activity E to that. And I could safely attach one of these at least. Doesn't matter which, in fact, but let's do that. Let's attach this one on. So far, so good. And it's tempting just to do the same thing with this as well. Just take activity C and say, well, I can join that on. The only reason I'm not going to do that is, again, if you remember the requirement that was mentioned at the end of the first video, that each activity has to be uniquely described in terms of an ordered pair of events. And so obviously this is going to be event number 4, and if I attach activity C to activity 4, then both C and D would both be described by the pair events 3, 4, so it wouldn't be unique. So this is another reason why we're going to need a dummy. And actually, not only do we need a dummy, we actually need another event here. So we're going to need a dummy there, simply for the reason that we just mentioned. But because we've needed the new event, in fact, we jumped the gun calling that 4. So again, I've had to sort of change that a little bit. And as I mentioned earlier, you should be prepared for your first one to be a rough attempt. You might need to cross something out and change it, just because you hadn't anticipated something that should have happened. And of course this needs a direction and a duration of 0. So now we've got our rough version down. We might decide to tidy it up a little bit and do a final version, and that's what you can see there. So just to summarize then, we've got dummy activities. There are two reasons why you might need dummy activities. In this case it's to preserve the order of precedence, and in this case it's to make sure that each activity is uniquely defined by an ordered pair of events. So that concludes video 1.2 using dummies and activity networks. The next video will be 1.3, analysing an activity network.